We'll continue on with the problem and evil and suffering. We discussed the logical perspective in previous episodes. I would like to move on to another shade or another flavor of the problem of evil and suffering, also from a logical perspective. Some non-believers claim that God created evil, and this is their syllogism or their argument. They say the following: God is the creator of everything. That's the first premise. Evil is something. It's the second premise. The conclusion, therefore, God created evil. And they go on to say, God cannot be all-loving because he created evil in this world. Now, what's the problem with these premises? God created everything. We can agree with that. We'll agree on that. Yes, that is true. God created everything. Evil is something. Now, we have a problem with this premise. It's the problem of the nature of evil. That's why there is a defense to the problem of evil and suffering called the nature of evil defense. The previous defense we discussed in previous episodes was the free will defense. This time we will discuss the nature of evil defense. Now, what is evil? Evil is not a thing. It doesn't have any ontological properties. Evil can only be defined as the loss of good. In other words, evil can only exist in relation to good. Because if there was no good, there wouldn't be any evil. Because evil, by definition, as I said, is the loss of good. It doesn't exist on its own merit. It has no nature in itself. Much like death. We cannot quantify the properties of death. Death, by definition, is the loss of life. Cold. You don't have any quantifiable properties of cold. Cold is only measured by the loss of heat. Light and darkness. Darkness can only be defined by loss of light, and so on and so forth. Evil can only be defined as the loss of good. So, when we abandoned the will of God, when we turned our backs from God, we did not turn from God to evil. And that is very important for us to understand. We did not turn from God to evil as if there was another direction called evil or another God called the God of evil that we turned towards. Absolutely not. But the mere turning from God is called evil. Not because we turned towards evil, but because we turned from good, who is God. That turning becomes evil. All right, let's look at evil as I mentioned earlier, an argument for atheists to justify their atheism or disbelief in God. A question: is evil and the problem of evil only a problem for Christians? Of course not. Everyone and every worldview, every philosophy, every religion in this world must give an answer to the problem of evil and suffering. So they must provide the following. Number one, they must provide a diagnosis of the problem and a solution to the problem. Every worldview must explain where did evil come from, what is the nature of evil, diagnose the problem, and don't only stop there, but give me a solution to this problem. And the answer must meet both the intellectual demand and the emotional demand of the question. In other words, your diagnosis and your solution must satisfy my intellect and my emotions and my heart. And we can go through all religions in this world and see how they addressed or responded to the challenge of the problem of evil and suffering. Well, let's look at atheism for now. As I mentioned earlier, evil creates a bigger problem for atheists. Why is that? Because every judgment presupposes a standard based on which you make that judgment. So if I say this is bad, I can only say that based on a standard that gives me the understanding of bad and good. Without that standard of morality, I wouldn't know what is bad and what is good. In other words, if I, for example, say that this iPad is old, what am I implying? What am I presupposing? That I have an understanding of what a new iPad looks like or a new device looks like. Otherwise, I wouldn't know if this is old or new or indifferent. But if I say this is bad, then I'm implying that there is something else that is good that I am comparing this to. But here's the question. What is that standard that atheists may use to determine what is evil and what is good? There's no standard. And I will share with you an excerpt from one of the most famous atheists, Professor Richard Dawkins. He's an English ethologist and evolutionary biologist out of Oxford University in England. He said the following: in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you will not find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at the bottom, listen to this, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So Professor Dawkins came to the realization that to be consistent with his atheism, and I do respect that, he's at least consistent with his worldview of atheism, he comes to the conclusion of there's no evil and there's no good. But my question is this the way we live our lives? Try telling someone who has lost a loved one, well, too bad, there's no evil, there's no good. Is this existentially falsifiable? Of course it is. We don't live with these premises that there's no evil and there's no good. Another question I have to Mr. Dawkins, Professor Dawkins. He says there's no evil, there's no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. Now my question is, how do you then know, Mr. Dawkins, that DNA neither knows nor cares? Have you escaped that plague of ignorance? In other words, how do you know that DNA doesn't know? Because if DNA doesn't know, then that would include you also, and you wouldn't be able to claim that you know the truth. When I ask atheists, personally speaking, I ask them, what is your response to the problem of evil and suffering? Some intellectuals would say there's no evil, like Professor Richard Dawkins. There's no evil, there's no suffering, it's an illusion of the mind. And some would say the following words: tough luck, too bad, it is what it is, that's life, and so on and so forth. In other words, you just have to accept what is going on, what has befallen you as, That's just life. Life is filled with evil and suffering. Now, my question to those who say it is what it is, or that's life, I would ask an existential question and say, when your world falls apart and when tragedy strikes, will you be turning to these responses to provide comfort and hope and peace in your heart? Hardly so. G.K. Chesterton, an English writer and philosopher and an apologist as well, he said the following: when belief in God becomes difficult, the tendency is to turn away from Him. But in heaven's name, to what? In other words, when belief in God becomes difficult in light of the problem of evil and suffering, I feel the tendency to turn my head away from Him. But to what? In other words, whatever I'm turning towards is not going to help me in the midst of my suffering. Because if something indeed came from nothing, then nothing is the answer to the problem of evil and suffering. And that is what atheists would claim to believe in.